At 5:42 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, a service elevator reached the 12th floor of a downtown hotel without any corresponding housekeeping or guest request logged at the front desk. The doors opened for several seconds, then closed again, descending to the lobby. No maintenance ticket existed. No staff keycard swipe appeared in the access record. The moment passed without human notice, preserved only as a routine mechanical entry. The hotel occupied a transitional zone of the city. A rail terminal stood 3 blocks to the east. Government offices and commercial buildings filled the surrounding streets. The property served airline crews, visiting consultants, trade representatives, and conference overflow. Guests arrived with briefcases, schedules, and limited expectations. They departed quietly, often before dawn, leaving behind standardized signs of short-term occupancy. Its design emphasized repetition. Corridors were long and symmetrical. Rooms were uniform in size, layout, and furnishing. Artwork was minimal. Carpets muted sound. The building discouraged memory. Nothing about a single room distinguished it from another once reset by housekeeping. This uniformity simplified operations and reduced attention, which management considered an advantage. Housekeeping followed a fixed structure. Each maid worked the same floors whenever possible. Supply carts were prepared at 6 a.m. with identical inventories. Linen counts were verified before and after shifts. Any discrepancy was logged as an operational matter, not an investigative one. The system existed to maintain order, not to interpret behavior. The maid assigned to the 12th and 13th floors had followed the same route for years. Her shift began at 6:15 a.m. She started near the east stairwell, moving methodically toward the service elevator. The routine was practiced enough to require little conscious thought. Doors were opened, lights switched on, waste collected, bed stripped. Surfaces returned to a baseline condition. Familiarity created precision. Over time, she developed an internal sense of how rooms behaved. Business travelers left certain traces. Airline crews left others. Guests checking out early showed predictable signs. Hurried bedding, half-used towels, minimal trash. Rooms left and used overnight felt different. These distinctions were practical, not analytical. The 12th floor contained rooms designated for short-stay corporate guests. Turnover was frequent but predictable. Check-ins peaked late Sunday and early Monday. Midweek occupancy stabilized. By Thursday afternoon, departures increased steadily. Housekeeping tasks followed this rhythm without deviation, reinforced by months of identical patterns. During several mornings that autumn, one room presented inconsistencies. The bed showed pressure, but little disturbance. Towels were damp yet carefully folded. The waste bin contained paper torn into narrow, uniform strips. No personal items remained. According to the system, the room had not been occupied overnight. Initially, the irregularity registered only as inconvenience. The room required full servicing despite its listed status. Linen counts needed adjustment. The maid noted the discrepancy on her cart log, assuming a clerical oversight. Such issues occurred occasionally and were normally resolved without further attention. Over the following weeks, the same condition appeared again. Always the same room. Always early morning. Always midweek. The usage suggested a stay measured in hours, not nights. It did not match airline schedules or known corporate accounts. Still, the anomaly remained subtle, easily absorbed into daily variance. The hotel discouraged speculation. Guests were anonymous by design. Housekeeping staff were instructed to clean and reset, not question. Security concerns focused on theft prevention and safety hazards. Anything beyond that scope was considered outside responsibility. Routine, however, depends on repetition. Repetition reveals contrast. The maid did not consider the room suspicious. She considered it incorrect. The room did not behave like others. It resisted easy classification, which made it noticeable without yet making it meaningful. Elsewhere on the floor, activity remained normal. Adjacent rooms followed expected patterns. Hallway traffic aligned with guest movement and shift changes. Nothing suggested urgency or disruption. The building functioned as intended, absorbing minor inconsistencies without reaction. The room in question sat near a secondary stairwell used primarily by staff and emergency access. Guests rarely used it. The door alarm was functional but seldom triggered. From a logistical standpoint, the location was unremarkable, neither isolated nor prominent. The elevator log entry from 5:42 a.m. was not reviewed that day. It remained stored among thousands of similar records. The room was cleaned, reset, and returned to inventory by mid-morning. The maid continued her route without deviation. Hotels erase themselves daily. Sheets are changed. Trash is removed. Objects are returned to standard positions. What remains are absences and accounting discrepancies. In that environment, awareness begins not with alarm, but with noticing what does not align. At this stage, there was no investigation. There was only routine encountering resistance. The anomaly had not yet acquired meaning. It existed as a recurring irregularity within a system designed to minimize attention. What distinguished this routine from countless others was the absence of expected markers. Registered guests usually left some trace of identity, even unintentionally. A receipt, a card, a magazine, a forgotten cable. These rooms did not. They were occupied and vacated with an efficiency closer to procedure than habitation. The maid did not form conclusions. These observations remained background calibration, a mental adjustment rather than suspicion. She continued to log discrepancies as housekeeping notes. No supervisors were alerted. No reports escalated. The system absorbed the variance without resistance. In Cold War cities, anonymity was common and rarely questioned. Hotels served as temporary nodes for people whose movements were professional and opaque. At this point, nothing suggested deviation from that norm. The building remained neutral. The observer remained invisible. The pattern remained unresolved. No decision had been made. No significance assigned. The irregularity persisted quietly within daily maintenance, indistinguishable from ordinary error, waiting for accumulation to transform routine friction into something requiring attention. The pattern did not announce itself all at once. It emerged gradually, through repetition, across mornings that otherwise blended together. By early winter, the same room on the 12th floor had appeared on the maid's discrepancy log 7 times in 6 weeks. Each entry was minor. Each was explainable in isolation. Together, they formed a sequence that resisted dismissal. The timing was consistent. The room showed signs of brief use between approximately 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. When the maid reached it shortly after 6:30 a.m., the space already felt vacated rather than slept in. The bed carried weight impressions but lacked the disorder typical of waking. The pillows were positioned with care. The curtains were never opened. Trash contents followed a narrow range. There were no food containers, no toiletries, no personal packaging. Instead, there were paper fragments, always torn rather than cut, reduced to similar widths. Occasionally, there were matchbooks without matches, collected from different establishments. None of these items violated hotel policy. Their repetition was what drew attention. The room's registered status varied. Sometimes it appeared as vacant. Other times it showed a one-night booking canceled shortly before midnight. Billing records were clean, leaving no financial irregularities to explain the physical evidence. The maid began to recognize the room not by its number, but by its behavior. Her awareness extended beyond that single space. She noticed that on mornings when the room appeared used, hallway activity on the 12th floor felt reduced. Doors that normally opened during early departures remained closed. Elevator calls from that section were fewer. These impressions were not quantifiable, but they repeated often enough to be noticed. She began marking times more precisely. Without changing procedure, she paid closer attention to when she reached the room and how recently it seemed vacated. The air was sometimes cooler, suggesting windows had been opened briefly. The thermostat settings were adjusted downward, then returned to default. These actions implied familiarity with the room rather than occupancy by chance. The maid did not discuss these observations with coworkers. Housekeeping culture discouraged speculation. Deviations were logged, not debated. Still, she adjusted her routine subtly, cleaning adjacent rooms first to allow more time to pass before entering the anomaly. The differences persisted. By midwinter, the pattern expanded. 2 additional rooms on the same floor began showing related inconsistencies. They were never used on the same morning. Each appeared active on alternating days. The physical signs were nearly identical across rooms, down to the placement of towels and the condition of the waste bins. This suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Yet nothing about the rooms indicated communication between occupants. No notes were left behind. No markings were visible. Whatever activity occurred, it left only controlled traces. The maid's approach remained observational. She did not search drawers or inspect belongings. Her role did not permit that, and she did not violate procedure. Instead, she compared what was present to what should have been. The absences mattered as much as the contents. She began to notice timing overlaps elsewhere in the building. On mornings when one of the rooms showed signs of use, the service stairwell door near the west end of the floor felt warmer to the touch, as if opened recently. The alarm never sounded. The door closed softly, designed to reset without notice. At approximately 5 a.m. on several occasions, she observed movement through the corridor while servicing other rooms. These movements were indirect, reflected briefly in mirrors or glass panels, never long enough to identify a face. The figures moved with purpose, avoiding the elevator bank. None of this constituted evidence. It formed an accumulation of observations that no longer fit within normal variance. The hotel systems recorded nothing unusual. The pattern existed only through familiarity, assembled by someone whose job depended on noticing small differences. The maid began keeping a separate mental record. Dates aligned with days when international conferences were held nearby or when government buildings increased overnight security. The overlap was imperfect, but recurring. She did not assign motive. She noted correlation. One morning, shortly after 6 a.m., she encountered a room that should have been vacant but was warm and recently aired. The waste bin contained a folded paper napkin imprinted faintly with an unfamiliar emblem. It was not hotel property. She did not remove it. She placed it back and completed her tasks. At this point, the situation shifted from inconvenience to concern. Not fear, but uncertainty. The pattern had exceeded her ability to contextualize it as clerical error. Still, she did not escalate the matter. She observed one more cycle. That cycle confirmed repetition. The same rooms, the same timing, the same control traces. Whatever occurred was intentional, temporary, and designed to leave minimal residue. The maid began adjusting her cart logs, recording discrepancies with more detail, while remaining within protocol. She included times, room conditions, and inventory adjustments. These notes were not flagged by supervisors. They accumulated quietly. Suspicion, in this context, was not emotional. It was procedural. A system built on routine was encountering a consistent deviation. The deviation was small, but persistent. It demanded recognition not because it was dramatic, but because it refused to disappear. By the end of the season, the maid understood that continued observation alone would not resolve the pattern. The system required input. The next step would involve documentation beyond housekeeping variance. The decision had not yet been made, but the threshold had been reached. The rooms would cycle again. The traces would appear. The difference now was awareness. What had once been absorbed as error was becoming a record. The ordinary routine was no longer sufficient to contain what was unfolding. The shift from observation to action occurred without urgency and without disruption to routine. On a Wednesday morning in early spring, shortly after 6:20 a.m., the maid entered one of the rooms that had appeared repeatedly in her discrepancy notes. The room was registered as vacant. Its condition suggested recent use measured in minutes rather than hours. The air carried residual warmth. The bathroom mirror showed condensation that had not yet fully dissipated. The waste bin contained the expected paper fragments, torn into narrow strips. Beneath them lay an object that did not belong to the room or to hotel inventory. It was small, lightweight, and deliberately placed rather than discarded. Its positioning suggested concealment within plain sight rather than careless disposal. The maid did not examine the object closely. She noted its presence, location, and orientation. She completed her assigned cleaning tasks without alteration, returned the object to its original position, and closed the room according to procedure. No items were removed. No drawers were opened. The room was restored to baseline condition with one exception. The object remained. At 7:05 a.m., she reported the irregularity to her floor supervisor using standard operational language. The report did not include speculation. It described a non-inventory item found in a vacant room with repeated discrepancies. The supervisor followed protocol, notifying hotel security and initiating an internal incident record. Hotel security responded with caution rather than alarm. The room was placed temporarily out of service. Access was restricted using existing procedures. No guests were displaced. The rest of the floor remained operational. The goal was containment, not exposure. By mid-morning, the object had been photographed, logged, and secured. Its nature was not immediately clear, but its design suggested intentional modification. Security personnel escalated the matter to corporate management, who, in turn, contacted federal authorities as required by policy for unexplained materials of uncertain origin. Federal agents arrived at the property shortly after 1 p.m. Their presence was unobtrusive. They entered through service access points and established a temporary workspace within an unused administrative office. The hotel continued operating without visible interruption. The agents began with environmental assessment. They reviewed access logs, elevator records, and room registration histories. The anomalous elevator activation at 5:42 a.m. from months earlier surfaced during this review, now contextualized within a broader pattern of unexplained movement. The maid's cart logs were requested. What had previously been treated as routine housekeeping variants became a chronological dataset. Dates, times, room numbers, and conditions were extracted and compared. The repetition across multiple rooms and weeks established consistency beyond coincidence. The object recovered from the room was analyzed. It contained layered information not intended for casual discovery. Its construction reflected known tradecraft principles: concealment within ordinary materials, absence of identifying marks, and design for temporary use. The item suggested signaling or information transfer rather than storage. Federal involvement expanded. Counterintelligence specialists joined the assessment. The hotel was classified as a potential operational site due to its location, clientele, and internal access structure. The focus remained procedural. No accusations were made. No suspects identified publicly. The maid was interviewed later that afternoon. The interview was factual and limited to observation. She described routines, deviations, and timelines without interpretation. Her role was documented as observational, not investigative. She was instructed to continue her duties unchanged unless directed otherwise. Evidence handling followed controlled protocol. The room remained out of service. Adjacent rooms were monitored but not closed. Surveillance measures were planned with minimal footprint. The objective was to preserve the environment that had enabled the pattern to exist. By evening, preliminary analysis suggested the activity involved multiple participants operating independently within a coordinated framework. The use of alternating rooms indicated compartmentalization. No single individual appeared to have full operational visibility. Federal agents coordinated with hotel management to install discrete monitoring equipment in common areas and service corridors. These measures were integrated into existing infrastructure to avoid detection. The building's rhythm remained intact. The object found in the room was determined to be part of a communication chain rather than an isolated artifact. Its recovery represented interception, not disruption. The chain itself remained active. At no point was the Maid informed of the broader implications. Her involvement concluded with documentation and continued observation under guidance. She returned to her route the following morning. The rooms remained clean. The pattern paused briefly, then resumed. By the end of the week, federal authorities classified the situation as an active counterintelligence investigation involving a suspected Soviet-linked network. The hotel was one node among several. The discovery had not exposed the network. It had confirmed its existence. The transition from civilian observation to federal control occurred quietly, without announcement or closure. What had begun as housekeeping variants had become evidence. The routine that once erased traces now preserved them. The environment remained unchanged. The stakes had escalated. The Maid continued working the same floors. The rooms cycled in and out of service. Guests arrived and departed. Beneath that continuity, an investigation advanced methodically, grounded in logs, timelines, and the careful handling of small, deliberate objects designed to pass unnoticed. Federal control of the investigation shifted emphasis from discovery to verification. The hotel remained operational, but its internal systems were now mapped in detail. Entry points, service corridors, stairwells, and utility access routes were diagrammed and assigned observation priorities. Surveillance planning focused on movement patterns rather than individuals, allowing activity to be tracked without immediate attribution. Monitoring equipment was installed incrementally over several days. Existing security cameras were recalibrated rather than replaced. Temporary sensors were placed in ventilation access panels and service closets that connected multiple floors. These measures were designed to blend into routine maintenance activity, preserving the environment that had enabled prior operations. Observation windows were defined precisely. Based on earlier logs, surveillance intensified between 2:30 a.m. and 6:30 a.m., with reduced presence outside those hours. Agents worked in overlapping shifts, documenting movement without interruption. Each data point was time-stamped and cross-referenced against hotel systems. Within 2 weeks, patterns emerged. Individuals entered the hotel separately using different access points, but converged in predictable zones. They avoided the main elevator bank, favoring stairwells that allowed controlled ascent and descent. Movements were brief and purposeful, rarely exceeding 15 minutes per visit. Routes extended beyond the hotel. Surveillance teams tracked exits toward nearby transit hubs, parking structures, and pedestrian corridors. No direct meetings were observed. Instead, timing alignment suggested relay behavior, with individuals passing through locations minutes apart rather than simultaneously. Analysis of recovered materials continued in parallel. The object previously intercepted was compared against additional items identified during monitored cleanings. Each item differed in appearance, but shared construction principles. Information was compartmentalized, requiring multiple pieces to assemble meaning. No single recovery provided a complete message. Federal analysts reconstructed probable communication chains. Signals were indirect, relying on placement, timing, and absence rather than explicit markers. The methodology favored resilience over speed. Delays were acceptable. Attribution was avoided. After several cycles, one individual was identified as a consistent endpoint. This person's movements aligned repeatedly with completed exchanges. The individual traveled under a legitimate professional cover, checked into the hotel sporadically, and departed within hours. The pattern suggested asset behavior rather than coordination authority. The arrest was executed without disruption. It occurred off-site during a routine transit movement. No resistance was recorded. Evidence confiscated included personal effects, coded materials, and modified objects consistent with those previously recovered. The hotel was not involved in the detention. Interrogation proceeded under controlled conditions. The summary emphasized structure rather than confession. The asset acknowledged compartmentalized participation, limited knowledge of counterparts, and indirect contact with a handler operating through layered intermediaries. Recruitment had occurred years earlier, facilitated through professional access rather than ideology. Operational methods were described procedurally. The asset received instructions through prearranged signals embedded in ordinary environments. Tasks were limited in scope, designed to minimize exposure. Payment and reassurance were routed through separate channels, reinforcing separation between function and control. The handler remained unidentified. References pointed to a figure operating beyond national jurisdiction, coordinating through rotating mechanisms that resisted tracking. No direct meetings had occurred within the country. The handler's role existed primarily as an organizing absence. Federal authorities evaluated the feasibility of extending surveillance to capture the handler. A controlled continuation of the communication chain was authorized. Signals were allowed to persist with monitored substitutions. The objective was observation, not immediate termination. The attempt yielded limited confirmation. Signals were acknowledged indirectly, indicating awareness of disruption without exposure. After several weeks, communication slowed, then ceased. The handler disengaged without visible error. The hotel surveillance was gradually reduced. Equipment was removed in stages. Access routes returned to baseline monitoring. The building resumed full operational neutrality. No public record reflected the investigation. The asset was processed through judicial channels under sealed proceedings. Sentencing reflected the limited scope of confirmed activity. No network was publicly named. Documentation was classified. By the conclusion of federal operations, the investigation had mapped a structure without capturing its center. The handler remained outside reach. Several potential collaborators were identified but not confirmed. The evidence supported existence, not completeness. The maid was informed only that the matter had been resolved internally. She continued her assignments unchanged. Her logs returned to ordinary variance. The rooms resumed predictable behavior. Surveillance records were archived. Analysis reports were finalized. The operation concluded without closure. The investigation had succeeded procedurally while leaving strategic questions unanswered. The absence of resolution became part of the record, consistent with the nature of the conflict that had produced it. Following identification of the asset, federal authorities designed a controlled operation intended to lure the handler into observable contact. The plan relied on maintaining the existing communication chain while introducing subtle variations intended to provoke a response. Signals previously used to transmit instructions were replicated and monitored, ensuring continuity while preserving the chain's integrity. The operation emphasized precision over speed. Surveillance teams were positioned along known transit corridors, public spaces, and hotel-adjacent streets. Equipment was calibrated for discrete long-term observation. Timelines were synchronized to the asset's prior behavior, with intervals calculated to capture patterns without disruption. Agents documented movement down to minutes and blocks rather than hours. Despite these measures, results were limited. Signals sent through the chain were acknowledged inconsistently. Some were retrieved without further action. Others remained untouched. The pattern of engagement suggested that the handler had anticipated surveillance or possessed redundant channels capable of absorbing minor disruptions. No meetings occurred in observable locations. Every interaction was mediated indirectly. The lack of direct contact reinforced procedural caution. Agents documented every attempted engagement, noting variations in timing, location, and method. Each anomaly was recorded for analysis, but the handler remained elusive. The chain continued to operate in a degraded but functional state. Attempts to force a convergence had failed. Parallel to these operational measures, analysts revisited evidence collected from the asset. Materials recovered earlier were re-examined to identify overlooked connections or latent markers. The review confirmed compartmentalization consistent with training to resist disruption. Communications were encoded with overlapping signaling techniques. Nothing indicated that the asset had control or full comprehension of the network. The handler ultimately disengaged. Signals ceased, traffic patterns altered, and previously predictable behavior stopped. Surveillance verified that individuals associated with the chain no longer followed established routines. The abrupt halt suggested intentional withdrawal rather than chance interruption. The absence itself became information, reflecting the operational discipline of the network. Consequences for the arrested asset were procedural. Judicial review occurred under sealed conditions. The asset received a sentence commensurate with the material confirmed in federal possession. No public acknowledgement detailed the network or implicated the handler. The hotel's role remained unreported. Operational continuity was restored as if the anomaly had never existed. Within the hotel, the environment returned to standard operation. Rooms previously showing irregularities resumed normal housekeeping cycles. Equipment installed for surveillance was removed quietly. Staff were reassigned temporarily to maintain operational consistency. The building retained outward neutrality, while archives documented months of careful observation and intervention. Despite the apparent closure, unresolved questions remained. Analysis suggested multiple collaborators may have existed beyond the identified asset. The handler's identity and location were unknown, likely beyond jurisdictional reach. Communication channels could have persisted through alternative methods, leaving strategic risk unmitigated. The federal response was necessarily limited to the scope of confirmed activity. The case exemplified a recurring theme of Cold War intelligence. Observation often replaces resolution. Detection confirmed the existence of a network, but neutralized only a single node. Control over the broader system remained out of reach. Absence of evidence for the handler's capture did not equate to elimination of influence. The environment continued to allow subtle operations, imperceptible to casual observation, yet traceable to trained scrutiny. The maid returned to her role with minimal change. Logs documenting repeated anomalies were archived. She was not briefed on the operational outcome beyond procedural closure. Her awareness had initiated federal attention, but the larger picture remained classified. Her experience reflected the quiet impact of ordinary observation within extraordinary systems. Federal agencies recorded operational lessons. Surveillance methods, compartmentalization analysis, and signal replication were cataloged for future use. The effectiveness of indirect monitoring, combined with civilian observation, reinforced procedural doctrine. Yet, these lessons existed alongside unresolved threads, unidentified intermediaries, inactive signals, and absent central authority. The building itself resumed a pattern of predictable routines. Guests checked in and out without interference. Hallways, service corridors, and elevators returned to normal usage. From an external perspective, the hotel appeared unchanged, its prior anomalies erased by time and standard maintenance cycles. Internally, however, it remained a node in classified records, a documented but silent witness to intelligence operations. Ultimately, the handler avoided capture. Whether by strategic withdrawal, pre-existing redundancy, or operational foresight, the central node remained beyond reach. The asset faced consequences, but the network's larger infrastructure persisted. Federal agencies retained records and surveillance data, but certainty remained unattainable. The operation concluded as partially successful in neutralizing activity, while fully unsuccessful in identifying leadership. The story closed without resolution. Ordinary routines had collided with clandestine systems. Observation had uncovered patterns, and procedural escalation had produced controlled responses. Yet, ambiguity remained. The Cold War's characteristic opacity persisted. Networks left traces without exposure. Handlers operated invisibly, and the line between visibility and secrecy remained uncertain. Final reflection emphasized that intelligence work is iterative, incomplete, and often asymmetrical. The maid's observation catalyzed intervention, yet the chain remained. Evidence demonstrated structure without revealing intent, compliance without clarity, and control without capture. What was known could be cataloged. What was unknown persisted indefinitely. The operation's conclusion illustrated the subtle stakes of Cold War espionage. Success was measured in preservation of national security and procedural containment, not narrative closure. Partial victories coexisted with enduring uncertainty. The rooms in the hotel returned to their baseline order. But within federal archives, the irregularities, patterns, and absences were preserved as proof of ongoing, unresolved activity. The Cold War's quiet tension remained embedded in ordinary spaces. Routine persisted. Observation continued to matter. Networks moved unseen. And in that persistent uncertainty, the hotel stood as both witness and participant, its ordinary walls silently recording what would never be fully known.